Welcome to the Basic Judaism class. The class last week, hi, you snuck right in, I didn't see you before. The class last week requested to study Olam Haba, the world to come. So we've got people coming in still. Let's take a second. Is every grown-up getting? You making sure every grown-up is getting that? Which covers an awful lot of territory, all of which is kind of unknown. Thank you. Is that all of them? We handed them all out? Okay. Well, then we may have to share, or I may have to print more. But I've got it up here anyway. And it comes from, as you'll see, the notes that I'm giving you are from the jewfaq.org, JEWFAQ.org. There are a number of places that have good references, good resources about Olam Haba. I've got a bunch of books on the back too. Some of it is more mystical than others. But we're going to start out with this, and that is that Olam Haba means the world to come, and that sometimes refers to what happens after we die, but it sometimes refers to what I'm going to call a messianic age or a messianic period, what is supposed to happen when the Messiah comes. And sometimes it overlaps what happens. So it's a little bit tricky when you look things up about what happens in the afterlife or Olam Haba, because you've got to figure out if you're talking about specifically just what happens when each person dies, or what happens when the Messiah comes and the world becomes what the predictions are going to be about no suffering and no hunger, no poverty, a world where the lion and the lamb can lie down together. That's also the Olam Haba. You see? The thunder is confirming what I'm saying here. Either that or not really happy that I'm talking about it at all, which brings me to the next point. In Jewish tradition, we honestly have no idea what happens next. We don't know what happens after you die. And therefore, and I'm going to say this from the beginning, and you'll even notice this in a lot of things, but I can't stress enough, what matters is how we live our lives now for the sake of this world. That's what matters. We live a good life, we make good choices because this matters. If I make bad choices and I mess it up, I messed up. What matters? That's what's important. It's not so much about reward and punishment for an afterlife. But I have to give you a little bit of history about it then. In the Torah, and I think I mentioned this a little bit last week, but in the Torah, it doesn't talk much about what happens after you die. And there's an awful lot of wonderful information in here, some great references. It talks a little bit about being gathered to your kin. It's not totally clear that that's not referring more to where you're buried, because it's not in any way giving us an idea that after you die and you're gathered to your kin, what? You're playing ping pong, you're having picnics. What are you doing when you're gathered to your kin? There's absolutely no indication about what is going to happen when you're gathered to your kin. Sometimes it talks about a punishment of not being able to be cut off from your people. And that feels bad. So it implies something about what might happen afterwards, but it doesn't tell us much about it. And I will get back to that, about the fact of not really knowing. So after having not really known what happens, I'm going to tell you that the aspects about what happens after we die have changed somewhat depending on the period of time we have lived. So sometimes we're influenced by the people around us. So if people keep talking about, for example, in the Greek period, in the Hellenistic period, where people talked about a mind separate from your body, and that's what constitutes who you are. And it seems compelling because it feels like sometimes the thinking part of you isn't totally connected to the physical part of you. Your physical part changes over your lifetime, for example, but the you inside of you still feels like you. So it feels a little bit intuitive that maybe that's what's happening. And then when it comes to burying your body, it's easy to imagine then that the you that was your mind or your soul, shall we, can be separate from the you that was your body. And the spirit, now we talk about a spiritual realm, as the mind becomes kind of a spiritual thing when you're talking in a faith situation, it becomes conceivable that the spirit can live on even though the body doesn't. The body gets buried and the body decomposes, but it feels like the spirit lives on. There's also the problem with the fact that in the Torah, often God talks about, if you keep my commandments, then you will be rewarded in really wonderful ways. If you're good, then you get rewarded. And if you're not good, then you don't get rewarded. There are consequences. But then there have been times when we made it to the promised land and we're being good and we're keeping the commandments, and God gave us many commandments and many of them had to do with the promised land, and we're being good, and some of us are being super good. We are teaching people the laws of Torah, and then enemies come and they say anyone who's teaching about Judaism is going to die. And so you watch the people who are the best of the best, the ones who have been keeping all the commandments, the ones who, according to what you're reading in Torah, should be rewarded, and you're watching horrific things happen to them. And so if you want to believe at all in what God says, and we do, then you say, well, obviously God didn't mean it only for this world. If this guy died doing the right thing, then there must be a reward beyond this world. And so Olam Haba takes on the concept of what happens after you die, and this possibility with a mind-body process takes on the possibility that your spirit can live on, and that can be what gets rewarded. But even with that, there's questions. What happens then? What happens once you die and your spirit goes, where does it go? Shuffleboard? I mean, where does it go? What does it do? And we don't know. Nobody goes and comes back to tell us. But there are actually people who have had near-death experiences. And there was a rabbi who wrote a book about, it's one of the things on here, Does the Soul Survive? It's one of the sources at the back, that has some really wonderful anecdotes about things like what happens when you have a near-death experience. And there's kind of universal things that happen to the vast majority of people who have near-death experiences, which makes it very compelling. Because people who didn't know each other, never heard of stories, are still coming up with the same kind of thing. So imagine, God forbid, you're in a car crash or something happens, your heart stops, and you are kind of officially dead, but then you revive, and you become alive. And most people, when they come back and they talk about that experience, most people will describe a white light. Often they will describe greeters, people coming to greet them. And in the vast majority of the time, almost 100% of the time, the people who are greeting them are already deceased. And the time when that's most compelling, and sometimes the people that are greeting them, the person who is in the near-death experience doesn't know them at all. And sometimes it's people that they love. And you've heard these stories, turn back, go back away from the light. And then the person comes back and they said, wow, they said, you almost died. And I said, oh my goodness, I saw this light and people came to visit me and they told me to go back and I went back. The time when the story is most compelling is when it's a little child. When a situation happens like a car accident and mommy and baby are in the car together and the baby is like 2. And so if what's happening is, which some people counter, is your brain is firing things and creating like a dreamlike world where you imagine that people are there to greet you. So if the brain is creating that, then you would imagine that a little baby would imagine mom or dad being there to comfort them and to tell them what to do. And what happens is, again, almost without exception, when a small child describes a near-death experience, they will only describe that their mother or father was there to talk to them when the mother or father was already deceased, even if the child didn't know. Like the accident happens, the kid gets knocked unconscious, goes through surgery, dies on the table, gets revived, comes back and says, well, I saw mommy, and mommy said, go back. And the child does not know that mommy's already dead, that mommy was in the car with the child. And it is almost 100% of the time that that's the case for all of these stories, no matter which part of the world you come from. And that becomes very compelling. And so this rabbi in this book talks about not just the near-death experiences, but he talks about past life experiences. Have you heard stories about people who seem to have memories of a life that, they were Joan of Arc or something? I don't know why it's usually somebody famous that they become that famous person. I remember one day, I have no idea that this is reflected any reality of a past life, but my brother one day, he was like 6 maybe, and he woke up and he said he had this dream about this family that he was part of. They were called the Hatfields, I think. And they were French, and he starts speaking French to us, remembering what he saw in this dream. Now, he didn't know any French, so I don't know how that happened. It looks like we lost power. Nope, maybe. And so I don't know where it came from. Maybe it was a past life experience. But there are so many people who have experiences that are compelling that it's hard to imagine that it doesn't really happen. And the reality is that reincarnation, past life, other kinds of life, like the Hindus believe that you keep coming back and you kind of improve your setting. You try to be good, and if you're not so good, you come back as a lower form of life until you, with memories of what you, not what you were, but memories of, what was the word that I heard? Something like memories of the consequences, not consequences, but the fact that there's a remorse. There's a remorse for how you were. So if you start off as a human and you come back as a cockroach, there's a remorse in there. And so the remorse fuels you to try to be better. And so the next time you get to come back as a caterpillar and a butterfly, and then you come back as and that you go through a cycle of fixing until you come to a state where in Hinduism it's called the nirvana state, where you come back as a wonderful. In Judaism, it doesn't define that. I mean, if you look at the notes I gave you, it's not like there's a dogma, but there are Jewish texts, authentic, wonderful Jewish texts that talk about reincarnation. There are authentic Jewish texts that talk about reviving the dead, resurrection. In fact, in the prayer book, in the daily prayers that a traditional Jew will be saying 2 or 3 times a day, there is a prayer that talks about thanking God for reviving the dead. And they say it 2 or 3 times a day, reviving the dead. What does that mean, reviving the dead? There are a lot of zombie movies out there nowadays. Maybe, no, that's not what I think it means at all. But it's part of something that has been an element in Jewish tradition. The tricky part now is, what is it that we feel today? We can have all of these backgrounds and things, and it exists. So if someone says, what do Jews believe about these things? I can guarantee you can find compelling texts that show that Jews believe all of these things. Do all Jews believe these things? No. That's what it's saying in our notes here, where it says, Judaism believes in an afterlife. Wait, 1 second, hold on, let me fix this so you don't have to see it so funky. There you go. Judaism believes in an afterlife, but it has no dogma about the afterlife. Go away, go away. Thank you. All right. There's no dogma. It's not telling you this is what it is and everybody needs to believe it like this. When we do talk about the afterlife, it's called Olam Haba, which literally means the world to come. There are things, there is resurrection, and there is reincarnation within the range of traditional Jewish belief. Temporary but not eternal punishment after death is within Jewish belief, traditional Jewish belief. And there's a lot of references in this Jewfact.org, jewfaq.org, and then M, and then Olam Haba, and it says that Tracy R. Rich wrote some of these notes. I just thought I found a number of sources for you that I was going to share, but I felt that this one has a lot of wonderful information in a concise place. My favorite way of thinking about what happens at the afterlife, though, goes back to what I said at the beginning. And that is, what matters is how we live our lives now. And so what happens in the afterlife is probably affected by how you live your life now. And so there's another wonderful book that was written by Dr. Ron Wolfson, he wrote a book called The 7 Questions You're Asked in Heaven. There's a Talmudic story that says that there were 5 questions, but he had expanded one and turned it into 7, and he gave descriptions in the book. The first question that you're asked when you get to heaven is, Nasata v'natata be'emunah. Did you deal honestly with people in your business practice? So when we talk about what could happen, possibly, when you die, imagine there is a judgment moment. Imagine there's this thing where God says, what kind of a person were you? Because that will determine who you get, what happens to you. Then the key, I think, is for those of us who are alive, is to remember that how we live our lives is the most important thing. So watch. Be honest with others. Be truthful with yourself and be faithful with your God. That gets you to answer the first question. The next one says, did you busy yourself with procreation? Nobody on their deathbed says, oh man, I wished I had just worked harder on that last business project because I could have really sealed that deal and it would have been great. Most people say, I am sorry that I didn't have more time to spend with my family or my friends. Most people will say, I had this potential. I could have taught people. I could have been with my family more. And find a way to leave a legacy. And it's not usually in what you do for your work. The third question is, did you set aside time for study? Kavata itim la Torah. Did you set aside time for studying Torah? It says that these are things, according to the Talmud, according to Jewish law, these are things that yield immediate fruit, which means spiritual reward, and continue to yield fruit in the world to come. Honoring parents, deeds of loving kindness, setting a time for study, morning and night, providing hospitality, visiting the sick, helping a needy bride, attending a funeral, probing the meaning of prayer, making peace between one person and another, and between a husband and a wife. And the study of Torah is as important as all of them. So, in other words, they teach us in a sense that you can do every commandment, and that would be important, and that would be good, and that would probably earn you a special spot in Olam Haba. But you could also do some of these things, and they're like that commercial says about the credit card. They're priceless. That some of these things are worth all of the other commandments put together when you think about how it made your life valuable. The next question is, did you hope for deliverance? Did you hope for salvation? Did you hope for redemption? When God puts before you good things and bad things, always choose for the one that has to do with hope. Believe. Keep hope alive. Number 5 is, did you seek wisdom? Did you understand one thing compared to another? We're taught that chokhmah, which in Hebrew is a wisdom, that chokhmah is the kind of knowledge that you get from experience. That's a really valuable skill. It's a valuable thing that if you're at the end of your life, you want to have gained knowledge from life experience. We learn that bina, understanding, is how you analyze situations. So you need to do both. You need to have a wisdom that's based on experience, and you have to have an understanding based on how you analyze things. The next question, and with that is, did you ask questions about your life experience that led you to wisdom? Did your analysis lead you to understanding? Are the things you spend the most time on the things that matter most? Or, as they ask, if you had, pick a number, if you had 5 minutes to live, what would be the thing that you would do with those 5 minutes? The sixth question is, were there earthly pleasures permitted to you that you did not enjoy? And we're told in the Talmud, it says, a human being will have to give account for all that his eye beheld, but he didn't partake of. So if God gave you apples, and you saw this magnificent apple there, and you didn't taste it, that's sad. That's what this world is for. This world is for appreciating. If you had mountains that you didn't climb, they were right there, and you didn't do it, that's sad. At the end of the life, God is going to say, I gave you all these things. What did you do about it? Did you take advantage of all these things that I gave you? And the last one, there's the story about Reb Zusha. When his students, when he was on his deathbed, his students said, are you afraid to die? And he said, no, I've lived a wonderful life. And they said, well, aren't you afraid that when you die, God is going to say, why weren't you better? Why weren't you more like Moses? Why weren't you more better? And he said, I'm not afraid that God is ever going to ask me a question like, why wasn't I more like Moses? I'm afraid that God is going to ask me, why wasn't I the best Zusha I could be? Why wasn't I more like me, the me that God made me to be? Or the Kotzker Rebbe said, if I spend my life trying to be like somebody else, then who's going to be me? I was put here for a very important reason. I don't know what that reason is, but I've got to be me. I've got to be me. So this is the nutshell of those questions that they might ask you. Were you honest? Did you leave a legacy? Did you set aside time to study? Did you have hope in your heart? Did you get your priorities straight? Did you enjoy this world? And were you the best you can be? So the best lesson that we can talk about believing in life after death is to make sure that what you believe in is life before death. Focus on your life before death. Those were some of the notes that I had, but I'm not sure that that was the question that you came asking about. So I'm here now to entertain questions about what you wanted to know about life after. There's a lot more information. Like, for example, we talk about resurrection. And there are traditions in many religions about how, for example, you bury the body. Jewish tradition, you're supposed to bury the body within 24 hours if you can. That's a way of respecting the body, not to let it be decomposing while it's still out in the air. Put it into the ground. Let it go from ashes to ashes and dust to dust. Except there's also a concept that says that when the Messiah comes, all the bodies, especially of the righteous, are going to get up and walk to Jerusalem and hang out together right in the promised land, right there. And so there's a little bit of a contradiction there about whether we're getting up or we're decomposing. But because of the concept of the hope of the resurrection of the dead bodies, restoring the living part of what you are, if in Jewish tradition a number of things happen, you need to keep your body intact in order to bury it. So, for example, if God forbid you need to have a limb removed, then you try to bury that limb as close to where your body is going to be buried as possible. Because when Olam Haba happens, that body in its restored form is going to march to Jerusalem. Or horrific times like when we have these suicide bombers, the homicide-suicide bombers, and people are blown into millions of pieces. There are trained people to find every body, anything that was human remains. Every piece of skin, every piece of blood. You tried to gather it all together and you tried to have all of that intact when you bury. I've got some of this on here, but So very good question. So then the question is organ donation. And the answer about organ donation is that according to traditional Judaism, organ donation was prohibited for a long time. But part of the reason why it was prohibited was obviously you want to have your body intact. And so some people, if that is what your belief is, if you're waiting for that resurrection moment and your body is important to that resurrection moment, then you would want to not donate any of your organs. And you would want to keep your body as intact as it can be. If you lose blood at your death, you're going to want to keep all the clothes that have the blood on them buried with you. On the other hand, there was a concept about prohibiting organ donation because the technology was such that you were risking the life of the person that you were donating it to, that it's not necessarily saving them. So then in some sense you would be doing this totally in vain. You would be ruining this opportunity for the person who is donating the organ, and you are potentially, by cutting up this other person, even though you think that by giving them a new fill-in-the-blank heart or kidney or whatever lung, you be saving them, you are also giving them a risk of death too. And saving a life is one of the commandments that will supersede anything else. And so it was prohibited for a long time for that reason. But many, even in the modern Orthodox world, will permit and encourage in some circumstances organ donation because technology has advanced to the point where it is no longer the same kind of a risk to the person that you're donating. Or if let's say it's not a donating after death, let's say it's, I know that you need a kidney, God forbid, and that my kidney matches yours, yay, that it's no longer putting both of our lives at risk, or either of our lives at risk. And because of that, to the same extent, it's allowed now in many circumstances. A good idea in Jewish tradition, when you have a question like that, as you know that, as you recognize that it's potentially a moral, spiritual decision and not just a medical, physical decision, is to talk to your spiritual leader and see what the interpretation is for that specific circumstance. And it's a wonderful way also, hopefully, of finding peace in what your decision is. Sometimes when the doctor says, well, yeah, and if you just take out this body part from this guy and put it in this guy, yeah, that sounds really scary, so what do I do? And if you talk to your rabbi, then the rabbi will show you in context with lots of textual background and legal background, Jewish legal background, why it's a good or bad decision. Autopsy also is forbidden according to Jewish tradition because of what it does, because the body is considered a gift from God. And if you're cutting up the gift from God, that's considered an inappropriate way of treating the dead. On the other hand, if the law requires it, if local law requires it, then you're obligated to do it. There's a law in Judaism, dina de malchut chadina, that whatever the law is where you are, unless it's specifically asking you to denounce God or murder somebody, the local law usually will supersede. You try to keep the laws of wherever you are. Let's put it that way. Again, if there's a challenge, if it feels like, well, this is wrong, talk to the spiritual leader, and hopefully they can help you through that. But that's a very good question. It's also kind of a wonderful concept to imagine that the body is a gift. So you treat it with respect. It's also why cremation wasn't allowed in Jewish tradition, because a few things. One is the body needs to be intact in case of that resurrection moment, if that's what you believe. Another is, this is the body the way God gave it to you, so you keep it the way God gave it to you. The other is a really strange reason. You know that when you cremate a body, the ashes are called the cremains. And the cremains, the facility, will be delicate here, the facility that takes a body and turns it into ashes, it is impossible for them to remove 100% of the cremains of what's there already before they put in the next body. And so, with all good intentions and with all attempts to the contrary, some of the cremains that were already done before you will be in there, and some of you will be left over. And so in order for your body to be 100% intact, cremation wouldn't allow that. Unfortunately, World War II changed an awful lot of what the laws were about death, because millions and millions of Jews were cremated. And if a Jew chose to be cremated, it was as if they were cutting themselves off from their people. It was kind of the ultimate eternal humiliation, and that's part of why they did this. We could not allow that concept to survive. So the people who were cremated during the Holocaust are remembered with honor, and not as if their bodies are cut off from the people of Israel. The same with tattoos. That some people have a concept that marking in your skin cuts you off from the Jewish people. And the truth is, it's not as radical as some people think it is, because in the Torah it says that permanent marking in your skin for the purpose of a mourning ritual is prohibited. It says that, as opposed to never do this, but it says it within context. So there are cultures that they literally rip their hair out, or they cut their skin, or they hurt themselves to show how much they're hurting about mourning. That's not supposed to happen, and that's the kind of tattoo that's specifically forbidden, I think. I don't think all tattoos are forbidden, but there were a lot of people for a long time that felt that the Jewish tradition was to never have a tattoo. And then when all of these people who survived the Holocaust had numbers on their arms, are we going to tell them we're not going to treat them the same way we treat anyone else? There was a concept that Jews were not allowed to be buried in the cemetery with the other Jews if they had tattoos, which is not true today in any Orthodox cemetery that I'm aware of. We have an Orthodox cemetery here, and if you have tattoos, you're allowed to be buried here. And part of the reason in the modern society is because of the numbers on the arms. And once you can realize, according to Jewish law, why that should be allowed, then other things happen. There's a domino about what other things are. So the attitude about what might happen after death and the attitude about life very, very, very definitely affects how we bury people. I had a funny conversation. It was funny after the fact. I have to admit, I laugh about it now. I have to admit that it was one of those moments that you kind of go, but which is not exactly a laugh, but it's kind of. There was one of our elder congregants who passed away. His wife was still alive. His sons don't live here anymore. One son has been the head of his cemetery committee at his new synagogue for 20 years now. So he's the one who's in charge of making sure the burials go correctly and all of the mourning rituals are being observed, and keeps track of who goes where and whatever. Well, when this man died, and we're not specifically talking about mourning and funeral things, but I give people some options. The Jewish mourning rituals are wonderfully comforting and wonderfully help you to ease back into life after this devastating loss. And if there's a custom within these rituals that you find awful and uncomfortable instead of comforting, I would rather not make you do that because you're supposed to be comforted by these things. I will rather find all of the traditions that are comforting. And there are things that are laws, and there are things that are customs or traditions. And I try to never let you break a law, but if it's a custom or a tradition, I try to make it so that it's meaningful for you. So one of the things that I give people as options is, when you come to the gravesite, would you like to have the coffin above ground, already in the ground, or lowered during the ceremony, left up and not brought down at all? And I give people that option because the wife of the deceased really, really could not, she said, I couldn't tolerate watching the coffin get lowered. I just can't tolerate that. I wouldn't be able to deal with that. And so it's her husband. She gets to make that decision. But the son who's in charge of the cemetery committee, one of the things that in Jewish tradition that we do, a wonderful mitzvah, is that we, each of us, is responsible for burying our loved ones. That we're taught that when Moses died, God buried Moses. That it's one of these commandments, it's one of these nice things that you can do that you don't get repaid, you know? It's not something that, well, if I bake you a cake, then maybe you'll bake me a cake back or drive me to work or whatever to compensate. It's one of those things that you do it knowing that you don't get compensated for. And so he, the son, needed to take the shovelfuls and put it on his father, the coffin of his father. And the wife needed to be gone and not watch the coffin get lowered. And so I arranged it so all of that could happen. She got to leave the site before the coffin was lowered. So we're getting ready, she leaves, we get ready to lower the coffin, and the funeral director said, we have to turn the coffin around, because in the Jewish section, every head is on the east side. And the son said, no, you have to have the head on the west side. And we said, well, all of our heads are on the east side. Why do you think it goes on the west side? And he says, well, because when the Messiah comes, you're going to stand up, be facing east, and walk to Jerusalem, as opposed to now where all of our heads are telling us which way to go. This was stand up and walk. And those were one of those moments like, I don't know. So I said, you've been doing this for 20 years, and this is your father. So I'm going to let you bury him however you want to bury him. And I'm going to go and research this more. And if I find out that we buried him the wrong way, when the Messiah comes, I promise I will come back and turn him around. And I found out, drum roll, that both traditions prevail in Judaism. That in some communities, they're buried with their heads to the east, and in some they're buried with their heads to the west. And there are some places where they're buried without a direction, but in most cases, that's what happens. You pick one, east or west. And my understanding is in Shreveport, at least, most of the cemeteries that I have dealt with, even the Christians, are buried with their heads to the east for the same reason, marching to Jerusalem thing. So that was a kind of fun ha-ha moment, because we don't know what happens. And so what do? You do the best. You're trying the best. Other questions? Those are good. All right, so let me tell you. I don't know what happens. I don't know what happens after we die. I found this book about the Jewish afterlife to be very compelling. I found it, Does the Soul Survive, it was called. I found it to be extremely compelling. But I can tell you personally that I honestly do believe that the soul survives, because I've experienced loved ones that I've lost come back. Not come back like I see them and I'm playing baseball with them. Come back that I feel their presence. And it's usually at times when I've been scared and their presence is with me. I've been confused and their presence saves me. Sometimes it was just like after my grandma, my mom's mom died. I would have these unbelievably vivid dreams of grandma. And I would give her a big hug, and as I'm hugging her, I would become very aware that I can't be doing this, that she can't really be here. And as soon as I come to that realization, she doesn't disappear in my dream, but I can't see her face anymore. But I'm still holding her, and I smell her, I can hear her, and when I look at my hand and hers, I can see every detail of her hand. It's like she's really there. And this happens at wonderful times, great insights, wonderful things. And I know that that's true. I know that even when someone dies who I didn't know, and I have to bury them, and we have this one moment in the funeral where we are trying to honor their life. We are trying to, I think of it as kind of send the soul to the next stage, whatever that is. And I don't know if it's harder to do when I know the person because it hurts, or when I don't know the person because there is an awesome responsibility to do everything in my power to do the honorable thing for this person who I didn't know. And there are times, between the time when I find out that someone dies and the time when I bury them, I am not myself. And I spend my evenings, my nights, trying to fall asleep, trying to think about what do I say as a eulogy to try to honor this life of this person. And I have a rabbi's manual, and the rabbi's manual for funerals has like a Chinese menu kind of a thing, a one from column A. And so you've got one section and it's introductory readings, and you've got another section and it's scriptural quotes, and then another section with powerful things about who the person was and what they were. And it goes on until, with a couple of sections, I get to choose which one of these readings reflects the deceased in a way that doesn't trample on and hopefully helps those who are remembering them, because the funeral is kind of for the people who are here. And I almost always get a kind of sense from the deceased of what I'm supposed to say. Like I'll say, oh, you know what, I'm thinking, and I rehearse in my head as I'm lying on my pillow. I could talk about, well, the Torah portion a week. That's a great way to tie this in. And I can say, well, Aaron did this and Moses did this, and I can talk about how the person did this, and this all tie together. And I'll feel really good about it, and I'll go to sleep the night before the funeral, and I'll wake up the next morning, getting dressed, and it will say peanut butter. Don't forget to talk about the peanut butter. I'm like, what are you talking about, peanut butter? Why are we saying this? Trust me, peanut butter. And so I will say something about, and you know how much they love peanut butter, and everybody said, that was them. Every time, that's what, I wouldn't even know where it comes from, and things will change, and I will get this kind of a message. But I don't know what happens. I don't know what the Spirit does. If you think about it, though, a lot of times the questions that come up about what happens to the Spirit and what is the Spirit doing, you don't have to be a rabbi. You don't have to be a sage or a tzaddik or to know that there are some things in your heart that you know is probably what it is. You've been around long enough to know it's probably what it is. So there was a time, for example, when a woman came to me who was Catholic, and she was going to all of the people who were her friends who were clergy, and she lost a son. And the woman was 20 years older than me, I'd say. Her son was older than me. The woman was probably much older than that, because the son was more than 10 years older than me. And the woman comes to me and said, Rabbi, I need to know in Jewish tradition what happens to the soul. Does the soul survive? And I said what I said, that officially in Jewish tradition we don't know, but I truly believe it does. And she said, if the soul survives, if my son's soul survives, is he going to recognize me? Is he going to know me when I die? Because if not, I don't even want to live. And so think about it. And you tell me, what answer do you give to a woman like that? You're supposed to have answers about something that you know you don't have answers about. And I said, you've lost other people that you've loved, haven't you? Like your parents. And she, of course, had already lost her parents. And I said, do you ever feel their presence? And she said, yes, I do. And I said, and they know how to find you? They recognize you? And she said, yes. And I said, there's your answer. I mean, if you know it, you already know it. So of course your son is going to recognize you. Your son's soul will find your soul. And then we had a moment where the question came up. A young woman with a small family lost her husband, a very sudden death. And she loved him very, very much. It was a very happy family, and she loved him very much, but now she lost him. So she found a new husband, and she loves this new husband very much. And she said, what happens when we die? What happens when husband one, who I love very much, and husband two, who I love very much, and me are all together at the same time? Like, is it going to be awkward? And think about it. Well, so there's a good question. And when the more you think about it for a moment, and in your heart of hearts, you get the answer. No, of course not. Where is there any room for jealousy in whatever this Olam Haba is? That's not what it's about. It doesn't matter anymore. That's not what it's about. If you, on the other hand, that same day there was another person who said, well, you know what? I have somebody in my family who I think was pure evil. And I never want that person, I don't want the soul to be anywhere in the same soul sphere as I will be. And I don't believe that it will be there. And so you think in your heart of hearts, what will happen? Will that soul, the evil soul, the soul who only in everything they did only hurt people, will that soul be in the same place? In your heart of hearts, you know, no, that's not what's going to happen. That's not what Olam Haba is. Sometimes Olam Haba is described as an eternal Shabbat. Sometimes, I was going to show you in here some of the other things. It says on page 2 of this, it tells us that this world that we're living in is kind of like a lobby, like an anteroom, it says, before Olam Haba. Prepare yourself in the anteroom so that you may enter the banquet hall. This world is like Shabbat, Erev Shabbat, the evening of Shabbat. Olam Haba is like Shabbat. The one who prepares for the eve of Shabbat will have food to eat on Shabbat. So we prepare ourselves through Torah study, through good deeds, through those things that I mentioned, I think those questions that we asked. There's a saying, I was going to do this, I was going to start our class by teaching you this song. The song says, Kol Yisrael, all of Israel, Yesh Lahem, they have, Chelek Ba'olam Haba. There's a potential place for them in the world to come. But nowhere in Judaism does it say that if you're not Jewish, you don't have a share in the world to come. Also, it doesn't mean that you just have to be Jewish and that gets you off the hook of being a good person or doing wonderful things. So if you look at pages 2 and 3 from this, the JewFact site, you'll find some of these wonderful things. There are also things that are so terrible that there have been, the threat of punishment has been losing your place in world to come. But the more you look at all of those things, the more they look like what it's called hyperbole, kind of exaggerated threats, that it doesn't seem to be real. There's also a concept potentially that if you honor the dead, let's say, it's especially true, they say, for your parents, that if you are trying to honor your parents, and you say Kaddish for them, the Kaddish is a prayer that you say that praises God. If you can say the Mourners Kaddish for your parents for a year, then even a soul, a person who was not good in this life could potentially be redeemed in the next world. And I think that if you look in your heart of hearts, you realize, I don't know that that means the really, really evil person. I think it means some of us have had parents who didn't always make good choices, and that if they need a little bit of help when they're answering those questions, that if you stand up and proudly praise God, it's a reflection on them. And so that can be the extra help that tips the scales, because it means they did create a legacy that tips the scales in their favor. But I don't think it's the kind of thing that if you had somebody who was absolutely rotten, that you absolutely evil, that you say Kaddish for a year and their soul gets erased of all evil. I don't think that's what happens. Where do you think? Look in your heart of hearts. And you tell me. You think that was a soul that could be redeemed? Yeah, so the question, in case you didn't hear, was where's the soul of Hitler? And could that be redeemed? There was something in here that talked about, it said very nicely something about, it does say, we definitely believe that your place in Olam Haba is determined by a merit system based on your actions, not by who you are or what religion you profess. We definitely believe that humanity is capable of being considered, humanity as a whole is being considered righteous in God's eyes. Let's take a look for that question at the end of page 3 where it says, and I'll read this with your indulgence. These are words that are sometimes referred to, excuse me, that are a little bit similar, excuse me. We don't have concepts of heaven and hell. Maybe I'm not supposed to read this. The place of spiritual reward. Somebody want to read? Anybody good at reading? Until this comes back? I think it's, I'm on the bottom of page 3 where it says Gan, Eden, and Genome. And if you need help with the Hebrew words, I'll do the Hebrew words.
Oh, okay, thank you. The place of spiritual reward for the righteous is often referred to in Hebrew as Gan Eden.
Yep.
The Garden of Eden.
Which literally means the garden, Gan, Eden, which is Eden.
This is not the same place where Adam and Eve were. It is a place of spiritual perfection. Specific descriptions of it vary widely from one source to another. One source says that the peace that one feels when one experiences Shabbat properly is merely 1/60th of the pleasure of the afterlife. Other sources compare the bliss of the afterlife to the joy of sex or to the warmth of a sunny day.
Which are like the same thing, right?
Yeah. Ultimately, though, the living can no more understand the nature of this place than the blind can understand color.
Which means they can try. I think I can do this. Only the very righteous go directly to Gan Eden. The average person descends to a place of punishment or purification, generally referred to as Gehinnom, or in Yiddish it's Gehenna. Sometimes it's referred to as Sheol or by other names. According to one mystical view, every sin we commit creates an angel of destruction or a demon. And after we die, we're punished by the very demons that we created. You like that?
Yeah, I do.
For some people, we like that. That could be a good Hitler kind of a situation. Some views see Gehinnom as one of severe punishment, a little bit like the Christian hell of fire and brimstone. Other sources merely see it as a time when we can see the actions of our lives objectively, see the harm that we have done and the opportunities we missed, and experience remorse for our actions. The period of time in Gehinnom does not exceed 12 months, and then they can take their place in Olam Haba. Only the utterly wicked do not ascend at the end of this period. Their souls are punished for the entire 12 months. Sources differ on what happens at the ends of these 12 months. Some say that the wicked soul is utterly destroyed and ceases to exist. That would be a nice answer, wouldn't you think? While others say that the soul continues to exist in a state of consciousness or of remorse. That was part of what I was talking about for the reincarnation concept. The 12-month limit is repeated in many places in the Talmud, which is the oral law in Judaism, and it's connected to the mourning cycles and the recitation of Kaddish. So I have a few minutes. I've got some really good jokes about what happens after you die. My favorite 4, I got a lot of good jokes about this. One of them is about, they die. They were a good person. So before they get to go to Gan Eden, they're offered the opportunity to see what the other place is like. And they say, yeah, I'd love to. And they go down there, and there's music, and there's delicious food. They could smell the food from where they are, watching from above. And they said, this is awesome. I mean, it looks like a great party going on. I can't wait to see what happens for me. I'm ready. Take me now. And they go up. Well, no, so sorry. In the first, there's this wonderful food. It smells delicious, looks great. And they look closer, and they see that everybody's crying. And everybody's grumbling about how hungry they are. He says, how could they be hungry? Look at all that wonderful food. There are these huge banquet tables, and each table is covered with delicious food that smells so wonderful from where you are. And why are they crying? And they say, look even closer. And they look closer, and they see that all of the utensils are 3 feet long. And when they try to eat, they can't get the food into their mouths. So they're all crying because they're all hungry. And he says, this is terrible. Get me out of here. So they go to the other place, and he sees the exact same scene, same banquet hall, same delicious smelling food, and everybody's happy. He said, how's that happen? He looks carefully, and he sees that they all have the same 3-foot-long utensils. And they say, look carefully, and he looks, and everybody's feeding each other. That's a sermon right there. But then there's the story about the same kind of idea. Guy gets to go down first and see what that's like, and it's great food, only this time they're eating it. And there's great music, and this time they're listening to it and they're dancing to it. And a wonderful time, and he says, I don't even understand how they're suffering here. I don't even care. Take me up there. I can't wait to see what's going on up there. And he's still like snapping his fingers to the music that he just heard as he's going up the elevator. And he gets to the top, and he sees 3 guys, each standing on their own cloud, reading a book. And he said, this is it? And they said, welcome to heaven. He says, wait a second, I've got to talk to God. This isn't right. And God, he says, I got to talk to God. He gets to talk to God. He says, God, why is there a party and wonderful food and awesome bands playing there, and all I've got up here is 3 people reading books? This is what I was good my whole life for? And God says, what, for 3 people I should hire a band? Those are the good ones. Maybe I'll tell you other ones next time. I don't know if I should. No, all right, so here's the 2. I can't not tell. This is about the death part, not about not dying. This is about death. So the way I was told this story, I'll give it credit to. It was actually, I heard this story at your mom's funeral. That after her mom's funeral, one of the funeral directors complimented us on how well different faiths came together to have a very meaningful service. And I kind of chuckled a little because there are things about our 2 faiths where we can get along well, and then there are things about our 2 faiths where we don't always get along that well. And but I appreciated the compliment, and he said, I'm Baptist, and my Baptist minister told me this story. He said, this is the way the minister tells it. A Jewish person and a Muslim person and a Hindu person die and go to heaven. This is the way the Baptist minister told me. And so they're greeted by St. Peter, and they are given a tour of everything that they can see in heaven. And so they see there's a golden pond over here, there's that same banquet table, I guess I'm going to have that in every story, and then music and all these wonderful things. And then as they're walking around, he says, St. Peter says, do you see that wall over there, that big tall brick wall? When we have to get to the point over there where that pole is, but you have to get past that wall, we have to be absolutely, totally silent. You have to tiptoe, you have to whisper. If you have to say anything, I'd rather you not even whisper. Just make it to the other side, to that pole, and then we can talk again. And so they all tiptoe. They're totally quiet. They get to the pole, and they look at them and say, all right, what gives? Why did we have to tiptoe past a brick wall? And St. Peter said, because the Baptists are in there, and they don't know anybody else is up here. I like that one. And it doesn't have to be about Baptists. I apologize, but the point is everybody is allowed. Everybody who dies is allowed to die. And everybody who has a spirit is allowed to be a spirit. If that's what happens, that's what happens. So All right, the last of the jokes then is that the wealthiest man in town asks to see his rabbi, the priest, and the minister, and says, brings him into his office. He says, I'm an old man, and I know I'm dying, and I don't have a lot longer to live, and I know you're going to try to talk me out of this, but it's really important to me. And he takes this stack of money, and he puts $1 million in cash in front of each of the three people. And they say, what are you doing? They're getting excited for a second. He says, no, this isn't yours. Don't get so excited. I will make some donations to each of your congregations, but I think I can take it with me. And so I am asking you, the three people who I think are most honorable in this whole town, to put this money in my coffin before I'm buried, because I want to take it with me. And they say, I don't think this is how it works. And he says, you can't talk me out of it. This is all I'm asking you to do. It's dying man's last wish. Please do it. And they agree. And so within about a week, he's dead. They're at the funeral. Each of them are seen near the coffin. And after the funeral, they get together for lunch, and they sit and they talk. They said, that was weird, wasn't it? Yeah. So did you do it? Did you put all the money in? And they all nod, and they say, yeah. And they look at the priest and say, did you put all of it in? He says, all of it? Well, the church needs a new roof, and I don't see how we're ever going to get to afford a new roof. So I took out enough for the new roof, but I put the rest in there. I'm hoping he's not going to notice. And they looked at the minister, and they said, did you put it all in? He says, yeah. Well, he said, not all of it. He said, I have 2 kids, and I don't know that I'm going to be able to afford sending them to college, and I really want them to go to college. I didn't think he would miss it. I only took out enough so that I could send my kids to college, and the rest of it I put in. And they looked at the rabbi and said, did you put all of it in? And he said, yeah, I put all of it. They said, all of it? He said, all of it. He said, I personally wrote a check for $1 million and put it in the coffin. Because can you take it with you? I don't think that's what it's about. I don't think that's what it's about. But I do think that I like those questions that we ask. I like the fact that I think that, and the longer that I live, the more it makes sense to me that we become alive when God gives us this spark, this divine spark. And that divine spark doesn't go away. It's still there. It makes no sense to me that divine spark would just die. And the longer I've lived, the more I have felt like I have seen that people I've known and loved, they're still here. The Spirit is still here. And so that's my take on it. We don't know, and we'll talk about it and probably laugh when we get to Olam Haba, and we'll say, yeah, remember you told us that stuff in that class, and that was really funny, wasn't it, what you thought there? Yeah, that was funny, wasn't it? Because I don't know what really happens, but I believe that the Spirit lives on. And I appreciate it. So now we have to talk about what we're going to discuss next week. Remember our list of topics, of possible topics? I had a copy of the board here somewhere. We have basic things like holidays and life cycle events and keeping kosher and none of those things. Pick up something that you always want to know about Judaism.
Keeping kosher.
Keeping kosher? Does that interest other people?
We're going to get to it when we get to Deuteronomy, it's called the Shema.
Shema?
The Shema.
Mm-hmm. We could talk.
Cover it in Torah, or could you?
We could talk about that. We could talk about the Shema is Deuteronomy 6:4. It's one of the few things I could tell you chapter and verse about, and it's 6 whole words long, and it's a very, very powerful. It's potentially the most important thing that we say as Jews, and it is in Deuteronomy. And we can talk about important prayers and liturgy, maybe structure of the service also, and the things that we say and what we say and why we say them. That would be an awesome thing. We want to talk about Jewish prayer. Would that be okay?
And the bedtime Shema.
The bedtime Shema.
That's a nice
Yeah.
ritual.
So in the Shema, right afterwards it says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all you shall love your eternal God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your being. That's our newer translation. But it also says you shall speak of them when you are lying down and when you rise up. And so it becomes part of the tradition to say it at night and in the morning. And there's a whole bunch of things that we could do. That's a good idea. So we'll dissect some prayers. We'll talk about ways of praying, and we'll talk about Jewish prayer. That sounds good. I appreciate. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And